Well, welcome everyone. We still have a few people who will be trickling in and they'll be joining us as we move on. Thank you for joining us for our second in our three-part series called Finding Home, an Advent study on welcoming immigrants, refugees, and asylum seekers. My name is Sarah Strossel-Kagi, and I am the pastor of Royersford Baptist Church. It's good to see so many familiar faces and faces that are new to me. And we are grateful for the gift of technology that is allowing us to connect in this way tonight. We have two guests with us tonight, all the way from the West Coast. And so again, the gift of technology that allows this to happen tonight. Just a couple of housekeeping things. A reminder to mute yourself if you are not speaking. That little button that looks like a little microphone. And then if you have a question during our Q&A time, you can go ahead and unmute. Throughout the presentation, if you have questions, you can use that chat box that's on your screen and type a question in there, and we will get to those at the end. We will have a time for questions and answers at the end of our time here this evening. So we will answer them all then, hopefully all of them. Last week was our first in this series, and there is a recording of that available if anyone would like that. You can write your name and email in the chat, and I will send that the recording out to you if you missed that. And our last session will be next week, same time. We will be wrapping up our time then. And if you can't make next week and you preemptively want to tell me to send you the recording, then you can go ahead and send a note to me that way. We are so glad that all of you are able to join us here. And with that, I will pass it over to Pastor David.
All right, thanks, Pastor Sarah. For those who don't know me, my name is David Brannicky. I'm the pastor at Grace Baptist Church in Bluebell, and I'm thankful to be joining with Pastor Sarah and others and Ray Skellinger to put this Advent study together this Advent season. Last week we looked at the theme of joy and release, and this week we're looking at the theme of hope in the desert. And in particular, the topic's going to be looking at how we arrived here in our current context when it comes to our context, our social context, our civic context of welcoming migrants, immigrants, refugees, asylum seekers. And as part of that, I thought it would be appropriate to do some biblical reflection on what does the Bible say for the community of God. And in particular, I was looking at the Old Testament. Since we're talking about laws, I thought we would look at the Old Testament law. And I wanted to share my own personal experience, beginning with, I'm going to share my screen here real quickly from the current slide. And if you see that, you should see a picture of a VCR. Why am I showing you a picture of the VCR? Well, these were contraptions that, if you're old enough to remember, you could record things off of the television. And one of the things my father and I recorded when I was an adolescent, a teenager, was back in the early 90s. We recorded the Rush Limbaugh show. Believe it or not, I was a ditto hit at that point in time in my life. And it was a syndicated half-hour TV program that aired at 1:30 or 2 o'clock in the morning. And my father and I would record the show, and then we would watch it together the following afternoon. It was a way for me to bond with my father. So as an adolescent developing beliefs about politics and social topics, including immigration, they were being shaped by these voices. And for some reason during this time, I never considered what Scripture had to say about immigration, about welcoming refugees or asylum seekers or migrants. Sadly, my home church did not even encourage me to consider it. Just was not on my radar screen. Until my sophomore year at Messiah College, I took a social psychology course. And being a Christian college, the professor, Richard Stevick, gave us an assignment to research the word alien, stranger, sojourner in the Bible. and to discover what the Bible actually said. And it quickly became apparent to me as I started the study in the Old Testament that the biblical text spoke clearly about what the community of God was called to do, to not wrong or oppress a resident alien. Why? Because they themselves had been aliens. They had been sojourners in the land of Egypt. And this theme continued throughout the text. The command was issued over and over and over again, and I was kind of overwhelmed as I did the study those many years ago. And these are some other biblical texts that talk about not oppressing the alien, the resident alien, the sojourner, the stranger. And there were some particular provisions that were made in the biblical law in how the people of Israel were to interact and to treat those who did not belong to the nation of Israel itself, but those who had come to join them in their community. And one of those provisions was to provide a way for the people to have sustenance, to have a way for the resident alien to have sustenance. And that was provided for in the law. So there was gleaning laws, right? There was a laws that said when you stripped your vineyard during the harvest, that you should not strip it bare, but leave for the poor and the alien, for I am the Lord your God. Second, there was equal rights for the resident alien in biblical law. So the resident alien who resided with the citizens of Israel, they were to be treated and to have the same laws apply. There weren't supposed to be a separate category of laws for them. They were to love the alien as they loved themselves. Again, because they had been aliens in the land of Egypt. One law for everybody. And then as I continue to read on into the biblical text, I realize that God has a special concern for the resident alien, as well as for the widow, the orphan, those who are on the margins of society. God wants to execute justice for the orphan and the widow, and who loves the strangers, providing them food and clothing. You shall also love the stranger, for you are strangers in the land of Egypt. The Lord watches over the strangers. He upholds the orphan and the widow, says the psalmist. And so over time, I was kind of surprised.
That's what I wanted.
This was an eye-opening experience for me as a young student at Messiah College. And then I came to the prophets. And again, there was an invitation to not oppress the alien, the orphan, the widow. And if the nation of Israel did not do those things, then the prophet said it would go well with you. However, if they did those things, as the prophet Ezekiel says, they practiced extortion and committed robbery. They oppressed the poor and needy. They extorted from the alien without redress. And the prophet sought for anyone, God sought for anyone among them who would repair the wall and stand in the breach. But he found no one. And we know what happens next with the prophet. It says, therefore, I poured out my indignation upon them. I have returned their conduct upon their heads. They have reaped what they sowed. And so from the very beginning of the founding of Israel, all the way through the book of Malachi, we see this concern of the scriptures to not oppress those on the margins, the hired worker, the widow, the orphan, and for purposes of our study, the immigrant, the stranger, the sojourner. As we move into our study this evening, and we learn about how we came to this place in the current moment of our history in our country, we know one of the founding narratives, one of the founding myths of our country is that people came here seeking religious freedom, and the white settler colonial society viewed itself as the new nation of Israel. But we should ask ourselves, do our laws reflect God's concern in the biblical text? Or do our laws deserve to hear these words from the prophet? Woe to those who make unjust laws, who issue oppressive decrees, and deprive the poor of their rights and withhold justice from the oppressed, my people. That study many years ago began a journey for me into discovering how we came to this place as a country and what is my call as a person of faith. And I think the biblical text is clear that we're called as a community of faith, as a community of God's people, just as the Israelites were called, to not oppress and to support policies and practices that would welcome those who have had to flee their home countries, who have had to leave their homes for many different reasons, and to seek asylum, to seek shelter from the storms that are going on in their lives. So I'm going to end our biblical reflection there, Pastor Sarah, and Ray, we'll turn it over to you to give us an update on Benson, who we met last Wednesday evening.
Yeah, and thank you so much, David. Thank you for those important words. It's sad. It's so sad for me to think of all the ways in which, you know, our laws are not very just, especially when you see how they're applied and how they affect the lives of some of the most vulnerable people among us, and particularly how they affect those who come to us asking for hope, asking for life, asking for our mercy. And it's way too often that we don't show mercy to those who need it. Last week, Benson had a chance to speak for a while, and you had the opportunity to ask him some questions, but just to get to know him, and he's here now. Benson, I'm not sure if I see your tab. You want to say hi? We'll see if he jumps on in the microphone in a second. I know maybe he's on another call right now because he's actually doing immigration law on behalf of a number of other Cameroonian asylum seekers. But Benson received the news this past Friday that his BIA appeal was dismissed. Now, you'll remember from his story, those of you who were here, that he had applied and the initial judge refused his asylum. He appealed that to the Board of Immigration Appeals. And the word just came back that they were not going to consider it, that they upheld and agreed with the initial judge's findings. Most of the immigration attorneys that I've spoken to about his case look at this and just think it's preposterous. This man obviously suffered torture, several attempts on his life, all for having spoken out against a couple $100 million corruption scheme in his home country of Kenya. And the most powerful man in that country right now happens to be the deputy president, who has been the one that's trying to kill him. And right now the BIA is saying that they would like to send him back. So he's here with me now, still in my house, and we are going to see which other avenues we might have to pursue this case, to appeal to the Fifth Circuit, to also see if we can have his original case reopened, and to insert some new evidence, new facts that have since come to light about the way in which this vice president has been doing the same thing, silencing other voices that would call attention to the many different immoral and corrupt acts that he's done. So we're going to keep fighting, and if none of this becomes possible, then we also have to look at other options, such as Canada. We're not quite sure what's going to happen if ICE comes knocking at the door, how we're going to do it, and so we need your wisdom to know how to best proceed for Benson and for the other asylum seeker who is in our house right now, to make sure nothing we do prejudices his case. So please, I ask for your prayers, and I know Benson does too, and I hope he's back yet. Maybe not to say hello.
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay, Benson, yeah, just if you want to say real quick, just hello and what's on your heart.
Hi everyone.
Hi, Benson.
Yeah, Happy to see you all again. You know, it's been an eventful week. And yeah, like Ray just explained, yeah, we got the decision, but I think it's just a hurdle on the race that one just has to jump and overcome. And I would be lying if I said I'm not scared. Of course I am. But I always live with the thought that everything happens for a reason, and you can only hope that this is for good reason. And I hope there's a way out, especially legally. I studied law. I'm a believer of law. It feels bad when I see judges misrepresent the law on matters that are black and white, and just for purposes of politics. And that brings me to the thought that we as Christians, how much of the wish of God do we actually practice? How much of it do we do on our day-to-day basis? You probably, if you meet that judge will say probably every Sunday they go to church and they'll think they're doing God's work. And it's a bit, and they'll say they're trying to feed their family by doing what the administration wants because they don't want to get fired. But then that begs the question, you as a Christian, no matter how much you want to feed your family, at the end of the day, how clear is your conscience that you did what God would have expected you to do in a similar situation or in a certain circumstance? As Christians, I think everyone needs to think about that question for the night. And thank you for all your support, and hopefully everything will get good.
Thank you so much, Benson. I think all of you can see why knowing Benson has compelled me to offer him sanctuary in my home. And Benson, just to let me tell you so very clearly as I can, that my home is your sanctuary, and I will do everything to make sure we protect you because you are my brother. And I also have faith that God is a God who knows your heart and knows your story and holds you in the palm of God's hand, that God is surrounding you and ensuring that you will be protected. I believe in a God who cares about the most vulnerable in our world and asks us to do everything we can to protect those that God puts in our care. So bless you, Benson.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. And God bless you all, even for the prayers. Thank you.
Well, speaking of injustice, speaking of the difficulties of navigating a system which seems to be so arbitrary sometimes and so unfair, I'd like to introduce you to another hero of mine who has dedicated her life to defending human rights, dedicated her last several years to protecting and saving the lives of the tens of thousands of asylum seekers who have come to our southern border to ask for our protection. Nicole Ramos is the director of Al Otro Lado's Border Rights Project, and she has gone to live in Tijuana and has dedicated every moment of her time in very, very difficult work to fighting on the behalf of those who would not have a legal representation, would not have a voice if it wasn't for her and the others in her program that are doing this. Nicole's originally from New York and grew up in New Jersey, studied right here in our backyard at Bryn Mawr, and studied law at Temple. So Nicole, thank you so much for being with us, and please share with us from your heart.
Absolutely. I just want to let folks know I'm working from 2 different devices today. That's the beauty of nonprofit world. My visuals working on my computer and my audio is working on my phone. So you may see 2 of me on the screen. Thank you so much for having me here this afternoon or this evening. I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself and a little bit about the work that we do and a little bit about what you all can do to show up for folks as allies and as people of faith. I got to Tijuana through a leap of faith. I was working for 6 years up until 2014 as a federal public defender in Montgomery, Alabama, working with people that had been charged with federal crimes and men that were on Alabama's death row. And during that time that I was in Alabama, I ended up meeting and falling in love with somebody that didn't have lawful status in the US and wasn't going to be able to stay in the US. And because God has an incredible sense of humor, that's who he sent to me. And so I decided I was going to go to Mexico. I had been in Alabama for 6 years and I was ready for somewhere else. And so I decided I would go to Tijuana and I would probably get a job somewhere in San Diego. I really hadn't thought through it, but you know, the leap of faith called me to Tijuana. And when I got to Tijuana, I started volunteering in a local migrant shelter. And I was drawn to do that work because when I was a federal defender, and I did have immigrant clients that were charged with illegally re-entering the country after a deportation order, they kind of fell into 3 different categories. You had people who were deported, but they had grown up most of their life in the United States, didn't really speak Spanish, and the US felt like home. And so they were just going back to their families. Then you had folks that some people call economic migrants who can't survive in their home countries a lot of time because of what US foreign intervention has done to those countries and destabilizing them. And then you had folks that were asylum seekers that kept crossing the imaginary line we call the border because going home was not possible. Going home was a death sentence and they just had to keep trying to find their way to safety. And what struck me about all of those clients that were criminally charged with illegally re-entering the US is that almost none of them had an understanding of what the criminal consequences might be for every time that they tried to come. And they were not anticipating to be spending any time in a federal prison for simply trying to get home, get to a place where they could feed their families, or get to a place where they could be safe and they could live out the rest of their lives in relative safety. And to me, I thought this is a need. People need information. People need to understand how the system works in order to know how to engage with it. And so I started doing a lot of Know Your Rights presentations in the shelters. And then from that work, I started getting requests to accompany asylum seekers physically to the port of entry because they were being turned away by CBP officers. And during the course of that accompaniment, it became very clear to me that US authorities were willing to intimidate and lie and threaten asylum seekers in order to get them prevent them from exercising their legal right, which is rooted in US law and international law, to seek asylum, to seek safety. And doing that accompaniment work as an attorney, as a US citizen, even though I am technically Latina, as a white presenting woman, was a place of incredible privilege. And my body, carrying those 3 markers of privilege, became both a sword. My legal knowledge was a sword and my body was a shield with a physical act of accompaniment. And those were light bulb moments for me during that time because it showed me that government authorities act differently when they are in front of lots of people who will go on to speak the truth of what happened, and those people happen to have certain levels of privilege in the society. Now, during this time, I was gathering a lot of data along with my co-directors in the organization. I have 2 co-directors, Nora and Erica, and at the end of 2016, after President Trump had been elected, we all just kind of looked at ourselves and said, we have to start suing about some of these policies, and starting with this policy of turning people away at the port of entry. And we didn't have any salaries. I was unemployed, living on my savings, my retirement savings. And Erica and Nora, they had jobs, but they thought it was a great idea to join me in unemployment and quit their jobs. And so none of us had jobs, and we decided, we're going to sue the US government. We have no money, we have no jobs. We don't even have an actual office outside of Nora's basement, but we are going to take on one of the most powerful governments on earth because we have the truth and we have the voices and the experiences of so many immigrants, so many asylum seekers to whom this has happened. And we filed our first case in July of 2017 about turning people away and about the wait list. And that case is still ongoing. We're going to go into trial next year, if this coming spring, if the government doesn't settle. And we've gone on to file 8 more lawsuits against the administration for violations of the right to seek asylum at the port of entry, as well as human rights violations going on in some of the detention facilities. Lots of people all over the country, and I do a lot of these talks every month, want to know how they can do some of this work with people without going to the border, because lots of people can't go to the border for financial reasons or family obligations or work, but they're horrified by what the government is doing to immigrants. And there are ways that you can accompany immigrants in your community that can be just as powerful. For example, there have been studies as well as anecdotal evidence to show that when people show up to their court hearings with lots of other people, particularly people in communities of faith, that has an impact on people in the courtroom. That has an impact on the judge. That has an impact on the government attorney and like the level of respect that they afford your client. And no, we shouldn't have a system where that is required, but until we break that system, this is what is required of all of us. And not only is it powerful in terms of the impact it could have on the people who have the power to make a decision, but it's also impactful for the individual who is literally fighting for their lives in that courtroom, to have just an army of people standing behind them. You could do the same with people that have to go for ICE check-ins. Going in to check in with immigration into a building and not knowing whether you're going to be able to walk out, whether anyone's going to know where you are because they've confiscated your phone and you don't have any money to make a phone call once you're detained. That is a truly debilitating and frightening experience. And you can see it particularly in some of the more high profile cases where people thought they were not going to walk out of that building, and that building was literally surrounded, and ICE didn't have any other choice but to let that person walk out of that building. And so that's one really simple way that people can show up, and in ways that don't cost any money and it's not the same commitment as some other ways that you can show up for people. Obviously, Ray has talked about being a sponsor. That is another amazing way that you can show up and accompany someone. You're not only accompanying, but you're providing sanctuary. And we see so much discussion of sanctuary in the Bible, and now in today's modern rhetoric, sanctuary movements, sanctuary cities, and your home can be a sanctuary, because really, when you think about it, can we as people of faith and conscience live with ourselves knowing that one of the only ways that someone is going to be able to get freedom is if they have someone in the United States that is willing to receive them, even just for a little while, even just for a few weeks until they can get somewhere else. So that way they can get out of prison and continue to fight their case from outside those 4 walls and barbed wire. And that's a really powerful thing that you can do for someone. And obviously, this is all leading into the idea of sanctuary itself. Now, we saw the practice of sanctuary with the caravan movement. Caravans of people acting in solidarity provided sanctuary, and it was sanctuary on the move. And they provided it to each other. And they did it to protect themselves against not only organized crime, but against the overreach of law enforcement that saw them as less than because they were immigrants. And as communities of faith, and particularly houses of worship, that is something to really consider, is the idea of offering sanctuary to people that have, exhausted all their federal appeals. And that's the only way that maybe they are going to be able to save themselves, is going into sanctuary and trying to work on a private bill with a legislator that could allow them to stay in the country. And so the way, we can protect our community just in the same way that the community protects itself going through that migration trail. I don't want to take up too much of your time. I know that you all will have questions, and John will speak, but those are just my sort of remarks and my experience and what we can all do from our different corners of the world.
Well, actually, Nicole, before we go to John, I think we do have a little bit more time. Something else that that perhaps you can address now, and we might have more questions about later. When that caravan came through almost, about a little bit more than 2 years ago, the one that Trump made so famous, we know it was just one of several mass movements. And I love the way you say that, sanctuary is on the move. The government began to add even more barriers to asylum, to the possibilities that they could ask for asylum upon reaching the United States. Can you talk a little bit about MPP and the Safe Third Country, that July 16th cutoff, and what that has meant to the masses of people waiting?
Yeah, absolutely. MPP stands for the Migrant Protection Protocols. We on the ground refer to it as the Migrant Persecution Protocols, because that feels more in line with the intent of the policy. And it's also known as the Remain in Mexico policy. But under that policy, asylum seekers from Latin America, not just the Northern Triangle countries, they are returned to Mexico. They're given paperwork to appear in court, whatever their local immigration court is in the neighboring border state. And they have their asylum proceedings, but in between their proceedings, they're going back to Mexico. And the impact of this program is, not only are you keeping people in Mexico for much longer, because it can take several months and sometimes years for cases to resolve, but people are living in conditions where they are living in tents, in outdoor encampments, living in tents in warehouses, sleeping in parks. Children are not in school. People don't have access to medical care. People don't have access to mental health treatment. People's mental health is rapidly decompensating. And both organized crime and Mexican law enforcement understand that MPP is a program, as well as the wait list, that ensnares everybody, not just folks from Latin America. It keeps people trapped at the border. And I mean, I live in Tijuana. I happen to love Mexico. I love Tijuana, but I am an attorney and I don't live in a shelter. I have a job. I have legal authorization to work. And so things are a little bit different for me, and I speak Spanish. A lot of our clients don't have all of these things. And so the Mexico that they experience is violent, is racist, wants to sell them, wants to exploit them, wants to disappear them. And that is incredibly frightening. We worked with one family where the father disappeared and his 13-year-old girl was made an orphan, and they were sent back, and they were part of this MPP program. The Biden administration has indicated that they are going to end that program. That was a campaign promise that he made, but we on the ground are not aware of when that will happen, or how that will happen, or the people that were impacted that maybe already had their case adjudicated or they were deported, whether there will be any relief for them. The other policy that Trump enacted was something called the transit rule. And we're suing about MPP. We actually have 2 lawsuits about MPP, and we're also suing about the transit rule. The transit rule made people who entered the U.S. physically entered the U.S. after July 16th last year ineligible for asylum if they had traveled through another country and did not apply for asylum in at least one of those other countries. And the other countries that had to be a signer to something called the protocol. And for our purposes here, both Guatemala and Mexico are signatories to the protocol. So if you didn't apply for asylum in either Guatemala or Mexico and get denied, you would be ineligible for asylum. And that basically means that anyone who's not Mexican is ineligible for asylum unless they've applied for asylum in Mexico. There have been several challenges to that rule. It is no longer thought to be valid. There's a DC district court that came out with a decision arguing that it violates the Administrative Procedures Act. We also challenged the rule separately, and then we challenged it in the context of some other case that we're working on. But it looks like the Biden administration, those two policies will be repealed.
Thank you so much, Nicole. Thank you for challenging those and the many other administration policies that you have had a hand in ending or helping to at least get closer to being terminated. Thank you for your valuable work. And please stick around if you would. We'll talk to John and then hopefully have some time for questions with you too. Thanks.
All right, our next guest this evening is John Fenestill. John is coming to us from San Diego today, where he serves as the director of, I want to make sure I get the right one, Via Internacional. And prior to that, John was directing the Border Church, which is a binational worshiping community that meets at the US-Mexico border. That's where I first encountered John and his incredible work advocating for migrants there and providing spiritual care for people on both sides of the border. And so, John, welcome. Let me make sure I get you up on my screen here.
Hi there.
John, how long have you been in the San Diego area?
Yeah, I was born and raised, in fact. And so my parents still live here in San Diego. They're in a very comfortable, very privileged retirement condominium for COVID, locked up. Haven't seen them in many months now. But this is home turf for me. I was born and raised, went away to college, went away to graduate school, came back, and then pastored a number of churches in Southern California. I'm ordained in the United Methodist Church. That's my denomination. And came back to San Diego in 2004, so have been back home, so to speak, since 2004.
In the time, both when you were growing up and since 2004 till today, how have you seen San Diego and that border area change both physically, in culture and policies in that area?
Yeah, I'll actually tell this story by starting at a timeline when I was appointed to serve in the United Methodist Church. Nicole joked about God having a sense of humor. Bishops outdo God when it comes to senses of humor. So my bishop in the United Methodist Church appointed me to our little congregation, mission congregation in Calexico, California, which is 2 hours east of San Diego in the Imperial Desert. The Imperial Valley, they call it, but it's really part of the desert system that spans the border. And so I was the pastor there from 1992 to 1996. I was a young pastor, and that was my first assignment. The little church I served in Calexico was my real introduction to the border. Like so many San Diegans, I had grown up really isolated from the border, cocooned from the border. You can live in San Diego very comfortably, grow up in San Diego very comfortably without really encountering the border. But in Calexico, I was thrown right onto the front lines of the border. My little church was 10 blocks from the border, and I was the president of a social service agency that was 4 blocks from the border. I didn't have anybody in my church who wasn't a border crosser. Every family in my congregation lived on both sides of the line. You hear them called sometimes mixed status families, or these extended families that span the US-Mexico border. So that was when I first was really immersed in the culture. I learned to get my Spanish up to snuff to be able to preach and lead worship in both languages. And the big takeaway from that for me was just what an incredibly wonderful experience it was for me and my family. What a blessing it was to me. We adopted our daughter while we were out there. My wife and I were newlyweds and ended up adopting a daughter while we were there. And that little church and the people of that community just surrounded us with such an extraordinary love and care. I'll never forget it. I'll never forget it. My daughter's now 26, so it was a long time ago. But she's actually living with us and during this period of COVID, and has a daughter herself. So I have a 2.5-year-old in the house who looks just like her mother. It's a little eerie that the granddaughter looks so much like her mom. But anyway, I'm harkening back to that time in part because of that. We have a little toddler tootling around the house who reminds me very much of this time in my life. And that would be my message would be that the border for me was in this period, and I'll begin the story there because it's really when the United States, under the Clinton administration, began what has turned into a 30-year policy of hardening the border and trying to, what we still in policy circles call a policy of deterrence, trying to deter people from entering the United States. As I mentioned, the people in my congregation in Calexico, the border was a street that you crossed or a busy intersection that maybe took up a little bit of time, but people flowed freely back and forth across the border through the port of entry and outside the port of entry. And the life of the border was very fluid. It was very much a place of movement, of encounter. It was a place of friendship. It was a place of family. It was a place of fiesta and community. And it's really over the last 30 years that under administrations of both political parties, the United States government has pursued a policy that labors under a very, very tragic illusion. And that illusion is that if we just make the border hard enough to cross, if we make it dangerous enough, if we make it deadly enough, if we make it costly enough, then somehow people will stop coming to the United States. Both parties have pursued that policy now for 30 years. And the facts on the ground are that policy of deterrence does, in fact, it can alter flows, we can reroute migrants, and we can discourage migrants, but we can't, in fact, as it turns out, put a fundamental stop and deter migrants from seeking to better their lives and to seeking the best opportunity. That people are very rational decision makers in my experience. People are making very rational decisions based on their circumstances, their own best interests and the interests of their children, the interests of the people they happen to fall in love with. One of my jokes about the border church, where I still convene groups on the Mexico border for communion, is that, young people have a habit of falling in love, that's one of the things young people do. And when people fall in love or find a calling in their life, they'll pursue it. They're determined. When they have a child that they want to protect or want to see the best for, they'll pursue their dreams with an enormous passion. Turns out that migrants and folks in the US-Mexico border region have a much, much greater capacity to withstand the suffering that we've imposed on them than our government has the capacity to deter them from pursuing their dreams. So over these 30 years that I've been living and working along the border, I was out in Calexico for a number of years. I ended up in Los Angeles, but then came back to San Diego in 2004, as I mentioned. The border has been hardened, walls have been built, policies, as Nicole, explained and experiences firsthand day by day. Policies under, again, presidential administrations of both parties have simply tried to make this more and more complicated and more burdensome on those who would want to cross the border, whether legally or outside of status, either way. So our government has tried to turn the US-Mexico border into a barrier and would want to promote that understanding of the border. I go back to my childhood, that idea that I grew up in such a bubble. Maybe you grew up, I'm guessing that most of the people in your Zoom room probably grew up with one of those maps, where every state was a puzzle piece. It was a puzzle map of the United States. I don't know if you can visualize that map, a puzzle that you had as a child, and it was just the US, right? The US was like floating out in the middle of the ocean, and Alaska, there wasn't enough room for Alaska. So Alaska was like off the coast of California, and Hawaii was down there somewhere by Arizona, and there was no Mexico and no Canada. And I really think that we are brought up in our certainly Anglo-Protestant culture and tradition to imagine the United States as an island. But of course, we're not. We're part of this beautiful continent of North America and part of the Western Hemisphere and part of the globe. And so I think that US is laboring under this illusion that somehow we can harden the border, and so policymakers and politicians and spokespeople, promote a narrative about the border. The border is a dangerous place. It's violent. It's filled with criminals and all kinds of peril. There's real peril along the border, as there is in any major city. Nicole was talking about Tijuana. Tijuana is a city of over 3 million people. San Diego, the same. So you have a metropolis of 6 million people. Of course, there's crime, as there would be in the nearest city to you. But for me, the border remains fundamentally a place of human encounter, a place of cross-cultural exchange, a place of transit, and someday I hope and pray it will be a place of safe transit. So that's where I'm coming from, a person who's born and raised here, has seen the border suffer greatly. I haven't even really spoken about the imposition on border communities themselves of all these policies. The people who live here and have raised their families here for generations, I could talk about that.
Yeah, tell us a little bit about that.
Well, so we call, again, the focus, which I commend you for, of your study is immigrants, migrants, asylum seekers. And those are all, but the majority of people I work with, majority of my people in my congregation in Calexico, the majority of people who participate in the border church community and the communities that we work with at the nonprofit I run, Via International, most of these would qualify as what we would call fronterizos. They're borderlanders. They're people who are often very, very deeply rooted in the San Diego, Tijuana region. Many go back generations. Many would have family on both sides of the border, would speak English and Spanish in varying combination, would construct their lives as part of an extended family, sharing resources, moving from one house to another at different stages of their life. And these families who, for whom the border is at an inconvenience in one way of framing it, but when that border has been hardened and militarized and turned into this instrument of oppression, as it has by our federal government, the folks on the ground suffer enormously, practically speaking, in terms of, how long it takes to cross it, long wait lines to move from one side to the next. But more fundamentally, I think it's a spiritual assault on the borderlands and the communities of the borderlands. Our government has assaulted the borderlands and has imposed on the landscape and imposed on the people these instruments and these demonstration projects of power that often serve no practical purpose at all. They're building walls in all kinds of crazy places that make no sense right now. Even Border Patrol agents will tell you, we don't need a wall there, we've got that controlled. So this projection onto the border of a false narrative and of a policy that we know doesn't work, that of just somehow someday being able to deter and discourage all these people from seeking to pursue the path that they feel called to. That's the great pain, I would say, of border communities is withstanding that assault.
John, can you describe a little bit to us the physical area of Friendship Park, which is where you all meet for Border Church, and how that has changed over the years? I think that's a beautiful example of this assault that you were speaking of.
Sure, it's a long story, and we're coming up on another chapter. We just met with San Diego Border Patrol last week, and they announced that they're going to build 30-foot walls across the face of Friendship Park. So this is a park where people have met freely and openly for eternity. Of course, there was no border there to begin with. And at the end of the US-Mexico War, the original boundary marker between the two countries, the first monument, was placed at this location. So some people call it the birthplace of the border. So, and people have been visiting that monument, souvenir seekers and tourists ever since that time, back in the 1850s. So, but in 2006, under the George W. Bush administration, the federal government took the land adjacent to the border on the US side in order to build double walls across the face of this binational meeting place. So our community, the Border Church, continues, so that of course we're somewhat remote during this period of time of COVID, but since 2011, we've met every Sunday at Friendship Park, where we celebrate communion binationally. I think we're the only church community in the world where people are standing in two nations and celebrate communion together every Sunday. And we consecrate the elements on both sides of the border because Border Patrol won't allow us to pass bread through the wall. They tell us that technically that's a violation of US customs law. I loved it. One day a Border Patrol agent said that, that bread, if you pass it through the wall, in US law, that would be contraband. And that always struck me very powerfully, that the sacraments, the elements of bread and juice, and the eyes of US law at this location and elsewhere between ports of entry along the border, to cross material across that border between ports of entry is a violation of law, and the material in the eyes of US law becomes contraband. But we've done it for 10 years. We'll go back to it as soon as COVID subsides, whether there's one wall or two walls, whether the walls are 18 feet high as they are now or 30 feet high as they seem to be determined to build in the next couple of months. We'll be back there celebrating communion and trying to tell a different story about the border. I think fundamentally the border is a place of communion. That's been my personal experience. And that's the experience we try to celebrate at the Border Church. So if you want to learn more, there's a long history. Believe me, I could bore you with all kinds of details, and I will not burden you with the minutes of our meeting with San Diego Border Patrol. My joke all these years is that the San Diego Border Patrol has been my board of trustees, and it's not a board of trustees I would wish on any pastor, believe me. But if anybody would like to learn more, they can visit friendshippark.org or borderchurch.org, and you'll get a lot of the history and the context, as well as an invitation to join us some Sunday if you'd like to drop in and meet the people. Our Zoom rooms, like you all here, have people from near and far, and include many of our friends from Tijuana.
Wonderful. Thank you, John. And for those, most of us on this call, not everyone is American Baptist, and one of our American Baptist brothers, Pastor Seth, is very active in that church right now. So our family is represented there.
Yes, indeed.
Well.
Yeah, thank you for that. I will plug that, and I wanted to say thanks. In fact, Ray helped to facilitate an application to the American Baptist Home Mission Society. I think I've got that right. Mm-hmm. Pastor Seth Clark, who is a part-time pastor at the First Baptist Church of National City, is my key colleague on the U.S. side. And we convene an ecumenical team of pastors from all traditions, all Christian traditions. And then on the Mexican side, there's a local border church team that convenes the gathering in Mexico each Sunday. So if anybody would like to get connected to either of those leadership teams or pastoral teams, we do have some pastors from far away who sometimes are with us. They've actually discovered us in COVID and have learned that on Sunday afternoons they can break bread virtually with people on both sides of the border. So I welcome anybody who'd like to drop in. Again, you're more than welcome. I'm glad to send you an invitation.
Wonderful. Thank you, John. Again, just like last week, we could go on for hours, but I do want to be mindful of people's time here. So we'll open it up for any questions anyone has, either for Nicole or for John or anybody else on the call. David, I think, were there some that came through on the chat that you want to read for us?
Sure, Pastor Sarah. There were a couple of questions that were asked. If you have questions, you can, before I ask it, just invite anyone to, again, type the question into the chat box. If there's a question you have for John or for Nicole, you can help me out by letting me know who it's for, if it's for both or anyone. But there was a question asked about how can one know when an immigrant is going to court in order to go and be a part of the supportive process that Nicole mentioned? Maybe Nicole, you could.
Yes, just want to unmute myself there. There are different organizations concentrated in the Northeast and the West Coast that do accompaniment, and you can attach to one of those programs, or different churches have decided to come up with their own accompaniment programs. I'm happy to connect with Ray to give some leads on the local organizations that are doing that accompaniment work, showing up to court with people and showing up to ICE check-ins, because they are connected with the nonprofits and private attorneys that are representing immigrants or that are detained and people that are recently released. So I will provide that list to Ray, and then he can distribute it to you all.
Yeah, thanks, Nicole. And I could also mention next week, we're going to have the co-director of New Sanctuary Movement of Philadelphia, who will be sharing exactly about those kinds of things, which they do. New Sanctuary Coalition in New York also does a lot of that, and we can have some of that information. But Nicole, every other organization possibility you have, I'd love to know about. So, thank you.
Absolutely.
And then the second question that was asked was, how can one become a host to an immigrant family or person?
That's the same concept. There's several organizations that work with matching asylum seekers in detention who are going to be single adults that perhaps don't have somebody that is either documented and has legal status, or they don't know anybody. And I'm happy to also make that suggestion. There's several that I would suggest to Ray, and they do host training. They have materials, so that way you can understand what is involved, because being a sponsor, it is a responsibility, even if it's just for a short term. And I think it's always great to work with organizations that have been doing this a long time and know how to show us best practices.
Thank you, Nicole. If anyone else has a question, feel free to type it into the text box, the chat box. I don't know if Pastor Sarah or Ray, if you have a question for either of our presenters.
Yeah, I have a question, and I'd like to hear both Nicole and John's answers to this. So new administration coming in January, and as we know, it will not just be a magical change of things, but if you were appointed tomorrow to this new administration, what would be the change that you make to immigration or asylum policies? You can only make one change.
Nicole, go for it.
You can only make one change.
To start.
I would abolish DHS. That takes care of a lot of things.
Yeah, I didn't mention that in my narrative, but I agree very much with Nicole about the impact of DHS. You know, post 9/11, one of the great tragedies was the creation of the Department of Homeland Security and the clustering of all these vast, federal agencies under the aegis of Homeland Security. So immigration, what used to be called Immigration and Naturalization Services. I have a guy, a friend of mine, he was a now friend, he was the assistant sector chief of San Diego Border Patrol. He went into Border Patrol in the 1970s out of the Peace Corps, because to go to Immigration and Naturalization Services in the 1970s was a logical career step. But when we took Immigration and Naturalization Services and other agencies like that and put it under the aegis of Department of Homeland Security, all of a sudden Homeland Security became the entire frame of the conversation. And there's nothing, these guys that I now work with, on the board, there's nothing that's not a threat to national security, because they've been trained and enculturated into an organization that perceives literally everything: a piece of bread, a little child selling a bracelet through a wall. Everything somehow constitutes some imagined threat to our national security. My one change would be to create a truly binational park at Friendship Park, to symbolize the different kind of US-Mexico border that is possible in the future. And in fact, we have a design program that's being rolled out this month, January, called Build That Park. If you want to go to buildthatpark.org, we'll be designing a binational park to show people what it would be like if there were a binational park on the US-Mexico border where people could enter and exit freely. We have several such binational parks on the US-Canada border. And in fact, Customs Border Protection, they know how to manage this kind of space. They do it at several locations on the US-Canada border. So the idea that we could pilot a new narrative and a new vision for the US-Mexico border at Friendship Park would be my pitch. And we're going to be inviting Jill Biden to come in August for what will be the 50th anniversary of Friendship Park. We'll be inviting Jill Biden because on the original day that Friendship Park was consecrated or inaugurated as a California state park, August 1971, First Lady Pat Nixon did come to Friendship Park. And after inaugurating the surrounding area as a state park, she asked her security detail to cut the barbed wire, and she walked into Tijuana to greet the crowd that had assembled there. And she said, "We don't need a border here, and I hope there won't be a fence too long here." It was just barbed wire at the time. But that's how far we've come in 50 years, from 1971 to 2021. And so we're hoping that this Build That Park campaign will illustrate, and some person in high places, a president or a senator or a attorney general or somebody like that, would catch the vision that by creating a truly binational park at this historic location, we could tell a different story about the US-Mexico border.
Thank you, John. We're going to continue taking questions, but we also recognize that it's the top of the hour, and if anyone has to leave at any point in time, you should feel free to do so. The conversation went into next question that was asked. It's part of this conversation right now. I think you've touched on it already. What is the motivating factor behind the assault on the border, the hardening of the border? How might we change that narrative? Yeah,
the source of it, I just put in the Build That Park link if you'd like to check it out. Just kind of this idea of telling a different narrative. And the more thank you for your interest in this. Thank you for connecting to people like myself, like Nicole, the solidarity that is expressed from a distance means a great deal to people working along the borderlands. And the more you can encounter people who live or work and or transit in the borderlands, I think the more you'll learn, as you are tonight, about this different way of thinking. And I would just encourage you to help spread that word when you hear people speak of the border, to say, well, I know somebody who lives on the border and he doesn't seem all that crazy. Or I know somebody who lives in Tijuana and she seems to be really thriving. You know, this kind of changing the narrative, I think, would be really helpful. And you don't have to do it aggressively. It can be gently done, but just to help us spread the word that the border need not be, perceived as a place of danger and peril. The motivations for it are many. I hate to say white racism is not, it's not very far down the list. The historical imperial nature of the American conquest of the Southwest. And then more recently, more approximately, the disruptive forces of free trade and the disruptive forces of the modern economy that uprooted so many people and caused so many people to seek, have to seek their welfare, in distant lands. That's a global phenomenon, of course. And in that respect, San Diego Tijuana is just one expression of this global phenomenon of migration, human migration. And thanks for that opening biblical reflection. It's a biblical story. We're all migrants, the migrant people of God.
John, actually, I'm surprised that you, I agree with those factors you mentioned, but I also think that 9/11 played a tremendous role in, first of all, passing the Patriot Acts, beginning the militarization of the border itself, and to a degree we had not seen before, just by driving the fear of those of us in the United States had toward anything that came from outside.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I mentioned DHS, as did Nicole. So, DHS was a creation, was born of 9/11. The reason I started in 1992 is that there's a real line of continuity that precedes 9/11. So 9/11 was a powerful inflection point, but Clinton had set the template. He was going to, harden the border and prove he was tough on the border in order to pass comprehensive immigration reform. That was the trade-off that Clinton was going to pull off. And that's the plan that W. Bush pursued. That's the plan that Obama pursued. That's the plan that Trump has ostensibly been pursuing, though he has other, motives. And I fear that that's the policy that Biden will now pursue, is that if we just prove we're tough enough on the border, then we'll be able to, squeeze enough Republicans onto some legislation that will afford, some relief to some immigrants. I think it's a formula that doesn't work politically. And I think, again, 9/11 was a super important point, but I do believe it predates that occasion.
Nicole, would you want to add anything to what John shared?
What I think it's important, as John noted, to know that this hardening of the border has been decades long in the process. But our treatment of Indigenous people and people of color is hundreds of years in the making. The country we stole from Indigenous peoples, we enslaved people to build up this country. And if you trace the history of prison corporations like GEO and like CoreCivic, you will find their roots in the holdings of families that were once slave holding families in the South. And so now they've just figured out a new way to enslave people of color and Indigenous people and just immigrants generally. And in these private detention centers, which is something that we are suing about, they force people to work for $1 or less a day. And they may not hold a gun to someone's head and say, you have to work, but they don't give people enough food. They don't give people medication. They don't give people enough hygiene products. And they certainly don't give people phone calls so that they can keep in touch with the outside world. And that people are forced to work. And so it's another form of slavery. And if you think about the concept of border patrol, green suits patrolling the border, looking for people trying to cross the line, the image and the function is really not much different to slave catchers. There are modern day slave catchers and they patrol the border. And if you look at the root causes of migration, particularly from Central America, well, Latin America generally, but in particular Central America, you see a history of transnational corporations, many times rooted in the US or politically supported by the US, that have destabilized regions, robbed indigenous people of their lands, or contaminated their lands to the point that they're not inhabitable and they're able to grow and feed their families on the crops that they would not or otherwise grow. Or the School of the Americas, which we host at Fort Benning in Columbus, Georgia, which trains military and other types of government officials, police in Latin America, how to stamp popular movements, how to control dissidents, how to torture people, how to interrogate people. And you look at every major human rights crisis in the history of Latin America in the last 70 years, you will find graduates of the School of the Americas. And so we have been creating this problem through this centuries of dispossession and enslavement, and it's just a different form. And it's genocide throughout history and how that changes. And I think that we need to have a real reckoning as a country and understand this history in order to have the arguments to be able to say to moderate Democrats or Republicans that your reforms they don't cut it. They're not acceptable. They can't make amends. They can't make people whole, and they won't solve the problem. It's a never-ending cycle of slave labor supply. And we have to cut it out at the root in order for us to be able to perhaps have an open border.
Thank you for sharing for both of you. The other question is in the chat box, Ray, is what can we do to be more helpful to Benson at this time?
And thanks again, David, Ray, Sarah, Nicole, nice to see you. Thanks for the invitation. I do apologize. I do have another meeting to join at 5:15. So I'm going to jump off, but I'll close with sending my best wishes and blessings to Benson and to your family, Ray, who are hosting him and offering him sanctuary. And to thank all of you for letting me drop into your Advent study. Thanks for having me.
Thank you, John.
Thank you, John.
Thank you so much for this, John. Hope to see you soon. Yeah, so how can we help Benson? I mean,
with regard to Benson right now, Ray spoke with me about this yesterday, I believe. And so I've asked our supervising attorneys to look at his case. And one of those supervising attorneys is also used to practice in Louisiana, so he knows a lot about the Fifth Circuit and Louisiana courts. And so they have, I believe, most of the file from Benson's appeal counsel, and they think that there are some issues there that are very ripe for appeal. And so we are gonna we're going to pursue that. We might have a pro bono do it. We might do it in-house. But there are many legal moves to be made. And so I think to support him right now is to offer your solidarity and your friendship and to make sure that you stay in contact, because if there comes a point where we do need to have a more public campaign, then we would need to, we would want to be a cohesive group so that we could mobilize really quickly.
Nicole, thank you so much for that. I so much appreciate that you took these decisions and shared them with some of the other legal minds at El Otro Lado, and we will definitely continue in contact and hopefully, work something out to be able to provide the exact counsel that he needs. He's had some great lawyers and working pro bono on his behalf, but they don't have the experience at this particular level. And so we're hoping, I think Benson's going to need all the legal minds we can put together to find the right solutions. And, we'll see one step at a time. I know he's got 30 days to appeal this decision and to ask for a stay of removal. And hopefully they don't ask, ICE doesn't come to ask to put him back in detention while he waits. That's what we just need to pray about. But in the meantime, as Nicole said, your solidarity, right now, Benson is listening in, he's looking at your faces, and I think he's, last week was extremely heartened to see how many people are coming together to talk about this. I think that probably means a great deal to him. So thank you for that.
Nicole and Ray, I know that at RBC, some of the folks have been talking about, would it be helpful at this point to write letters to our senators and Congress people? Is that something that's effective now, or hold off, or what, is there a step to take? I think that I think I can speak for most of the people on this call that our solidarity is there, our prayers are there, and so many of these folks want to do, and maybe there is nothing to do, but
right at this moment I would not suggest that there is something to do, because when you're making those entreaties to your congressperson or your senator, you want to have a really focused ask.
okay.
And right now there's still a lot of stuff to be done in the federal court that we don't have the ask fully formed.
Great, thank you for that.
Cool. It's about 8:15, and there's no additional questions in the chat box. I think we'll bring our time together to a close. We want to thank John and thank Nicole for their time, for sharing this time with us. Yeah. And very informative. And I think we can see, for me, it was helpful to understand some of the historical context of the origins and the contrast over the last 50 years, and how things have changed, and how there have been this hardening of the laws that have affected people in real ways that I think it's very clear that they do not live up to the biblical commands and mandates to care for the sojourner, the migrant, the asylum seeker, the refugee. And if we are the people of God, we are called to do that. And we are called to ask our legislators to fulfill the civic responsibility, because a lot of the more recent laws conflict, as Nicole said, with existing laws that were already present for migrant and asylum seekers. So I'm going to close like I did last week with a poem, an Advent poem by Anne Weems. And then after I read the poem, I'm going to invite Pastor Doug Stratton, who's on the call, to close us out with prayer. This poem is called Toward the Light. Too often our answer to the darkness is not running toward Bethlehem, but running away. We ought to know by now that we can't see where we're going in the dark. Running away is rampant. Separation is stylish. Separation from mates, from friends, from self. Run and tranquilize. Don't talk about it. Avoid. Run away and join the army of those who have already run away. When are we going to learn that Christmas peace comes only when we turn and face the darkness? Only then will we be able to see the light of the world.
Thank you, David. As I've listened tonight, my prayer has become a prayer of repentance and confession, because I've realized how frequently I've permitted my own privilege to blind me to what's happening politically and physically around me. Would you join me now in prayer? As we've shared tonight, Father, we have become so aware of the world in which we live in, of the bubble in which we exist, and of the blindness that so frequently reigns in our lives. Bring us to repentance, and then prepare us for action. We pray for Benson tonight and lift his case his life, his family, and his witness before you. We thank you for the work of John and Nicole and so many others who are laboring in order to see that justice will flow like a never-ending stream. Show us how to do justice, to love mercy, and to walk humbly through Jesus our Lord. Amen.
Well, thank you everyone for being here. Before you leave, if you want to give a shout out, hello, or.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, everyone. We hope to see you next week.
Thank you guys. Awesome
Thank
session.
you.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Thank you, Ray. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Well,
Thank
Thank you
you.
all for being a part of this. It does give us hope.
Thank you.
Thank you
Bye.
from Delaware.
Yes.
Thank you for
Thanks,
all.
Pastor Sarah.
Thank you for your message. I really enjoyed it.
God bless you, Benson. We're praying for you.
Blessings,
Yeah.
everybody. We'll see you
Yeah.
next
Care,
week.
everyone. See you next week.
Thank you all so very, very much.